The Vatican disclosed its budget deficit this week, $3.5 million, but it was apparently less than anticipated. And a debate seems to have sprung up over the infallibility of Pope Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae, dealing with contraception. Will we be seeing a modification of church teaching? Joining me now for always insightful analysis and commentary is the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of the Catholic Thing, Robert Royal, and canon, lawyer, and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray, whom we pulled back from vacation to be with us. Gentlemen, before we proceed, I just want to get your take on this house arrest of Bishop Rolando Alvarez in Nicaragua, which we just covered. This is a very important story that hasn't been getting much coverage in the U.S. Father, your reaction quickly.
Yes, well, this is the Ortega dictatorship going after one of its principal opponents, which is the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church in Nicaragua sides with the people. They represent freedom, the ability to operate according to, the law of God, not the law of man. And this, heavy-handed dictatorial type power that Ortega and his cronies are using is, again, a further outrage. And the people of Nicaragua deserve better. Remember that the government expelled the nuncio a few months ago, and now they're putting the bishop under house arrest. Many people are suffering there, particularly those defending the rights of the Catholic Church.
Bob, I'll ask you what I asked Nicole in our last segment. Where is the Vatican outrage, the consistent complaint against a bishop being abused this way?
Yeah, unfortunately, the Pope has been rather friendly toward regimes like the Nicaraguan regime, like Daniel Ortega, who has connections with the Cubans, who has connections with Maduro in Venezuela. These are, the pariah states in Latin America. And he seems to be very reluctant to speak out against them because of this view that he has that there's some sort. He said about Cuba, for example, that it's a symbol. Well, he didn't say specifically what it's a symbol of, but for most of us, it's a symbol of the awful communism that entered in the 50s and 60s in parts of Latin America and then threatened places like Nicaragua with a very Marxist-oriented liberation theology. So it's unfortunate. It's not only the bishops. They've shut down, I think, a half dozen radio stations and some other activities. It's very typical. I mean, I feel like I'm back in the 1980s when I first came to Washington, when Nicaragua was a big deal. And we could see that if it had not been for the collapse of the Soviet Union, we would have had this communist dictatorship there even earlier. But as it is, Ortega has been there for 15 or 16 years, and there doesn't seem to be any will in Rome to speak out about the abuses even, let alone the nature of the regime, which even our U.S. government, even the Biden administration, has been very strong in criticizing.
Yeah. I want to move on to the news. The Vatican is in the red, gentlemen. The Secretariat of the Economy announced a shortfall of 3.4 million euros, along with 8.1 million euro surplus in the operational budget. Now, according to Jesuit Father Antonio Guerrero Alves, the prefect of the Secretariat, a deficit of 3 million euros in a budget of 1.1 billion is not a lot. It is practically balanced, and it does not seem like a figure to cause concern. But if we do a more detailed analysis, there are some areas for improvement ahead. Bob, what do you make of the recent numbers and the comfort that Alves seems to have with a several million-dollar deficit, though it was far less than the 33 million euros that was originally projected to be in the red?
Right. Well, look, we're starting to get more transparency on the financial side. I think almost everybody recognizes that Francis has been slowly, and with fits and starts, we're starting to get a little bit better of a handle on how the Vatican takes in money and how it spends money. Now, we still are not entirely there. I wouldn't regard this as squeaky clean and something that we can recognize as presenting a true picture. Something like 30 more institutions were included in this analysis, so it's not comparing apples to apples, it's apples to oranges. I was surprised in the reports that he said that the Vatican sells off assets every year. And I think in the past year, they sold off something like $25 million in, I don't know what. It could be real estate, it could be other things. So if that is an ongoing way of trying to close the budget gap, you have to ask yourself, how good is that? But look, this is an ongoing story. It seems that things are improving. At least we have better information. And let's hope in the future we really get to the bottom of where things stand.
Father, picking up on what Bob said there, does this go far enough to guarantee the transparency of the Vatican's overall financial situation? And what about the underfunded pension system? That's a ticking time bomb. And the Vatican's financial scandal, of course, involving Cardinal Beshu, that goes on as well.
Right. I think Bob is correct. It is an improvement in one sense, but it's not a complete picture. And certainly when we heard about this shortfall expected in the pension plan, that is a ticking time bomb, because as we know, in the last 40 years, the payroll of the Vatican has expanded greatly. In fact, under Popes John Paul II and Benedict, there were some attempts to reduce the payroll, but at the same time, there was an expansion of the Vatican bureaucracy. So I think we need some streamlining. I know the Pope, of course, has reissued a document, or issued a document about the Roman Curia, which combined some offices. But I don't think there was any massive cutting of, let's say, excess employees. That's really how you have to deal with when you have a pension shortfall. You kind of reduce your obligations. And then likewise, what exactly is the overall picture involving every single entity of the Holy See and then Vatican City State? Because selling assets is a dead end because eventually you're going to run out.
Right. Well, Cardinal Pell has been warning about this for years, that the Vatican's headed down a perilous path. But $3 million being in deficit is kind of small change now. But as you say, it could mean far greater deficits in the days ahead. Now, over the past week, the Vatican's Pontifical Academy for Life has raised some eyebrows. Last month, the Academy released a publication called Theological Ethics of Life, which to some argues that Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae, a magisterial document, may not be covered by papal infallibility. Some scholars quoted in the publication appear to argue that in certain limited situations, couples might be justified in using artificial contraception and some methods of artificial reproduction. Father Jerry, canonically, what is the status of St. Pope Paul VI's encyclical, we might add? Does it fall under papal infallibility?
It falls under what's called the infallibility of the ordinary magisterium, which is what the Catholic Church has always taught and never contradicted, and taught in a consistent manner about artificial contraception or any forms of artificial birth control. The Church has never endorsed it, always condemned it, said it violates the moral law, the order that God has instilled in man and woman, the purpose of sexuality. So all that is taught infallibly by the ordinary magisterium. Now, they say that it is not taught by an act of papal infallibility, which is, something that we could debate about that. Certainly, there was no act such as in the Assumption or the Immaculate Conception where it's identified as such. But on the other hand, let's get back to a more basic point in theology. Just because it's not infallibly taught by the papal magisterium, as they're alleging, doesn't mean it's not true. Because the papal magisterium's never made an extraordinary statement saying that the commandment, thou shalt not steal, is infallibly taught. Most of Catholic teaching is taught as in the ordinary manner as something you need to believe in order to be saved. And infallibility is added when there's a disputed question and to give it a firmer basis for belief. But the basis for belief is already present before the infallible act. So what we got, what's going on here, Raymond, let's be clear. These people don't like Humanae Vitae. They want to endorse contraception, so they're using every sort of argument we've heard for the last 40 or 50 years to try and impugn it. What bothers me most is, why is a Vatican publishing house and the Academy of Life proposing this under the guise of an academic discussion? That's just a smokescreen. This is really a conspiracy, I think, on the part of some people.
Bob, your thoughts on the reasoning here, which sounds very 1970s, something we might come up out of the German synodal way, where, new thinking has informed our teaching, and now the teaching will evolve to catch up.
Yeah, I don't have much respect for the rationale behind this. This has been tried, as Father said, ever since Humanae Vitae came out. Initially, they used to talk about, is that teaching reformable? You know, so they stayed away from the question of infallibility. And for me, you know, what the philosophers and theologians call this is it's proportionalism, or it's kind of situation ethics, where in certain circumstances, and this argument was actually made also in Amoris Laetitia, that in certain circumstances that people find themselves in, the best that they can do is actually to practice an intrinsic evil. This is something that the Church has never taught. And we know, whether it's the ordinary magisterium or the extraordinary magisterium, the Church has consistently always taught from the very beginning that contraception was wrong. They start arguing that this, you know, it could be like Galileo, that we find that the Earth moves around the sun rather than the sun moves around the Earth. This is nonsense. In moral matters, we don't have those sort of Copernican revolutions. We may find out that there are other grounds for supporting the traditional teaching, but we don't reverse the traditional teaching as if somehow we're smarter or we're more moral or we have greater insight into God's intentions for his holy people. I agree with Father entirely. This is a smokescreen. I've heard from some sources that the Holy Father himself is not really all that excited about going down this road, but I think this bears very careful watching.
Speaking of the Synod, the Vatican is enlisting what they call lay Catholic influencers to work with the Dicastery for Communications to reach out to so-called unaccounted for Catholics, young people in particular. Now, what they're trying to do is get them to participate in the Vatican's online synod surveys. Catholic apologist Jimmy Akin is one of those who have taken to Twitter to drive traffic to this survey. Father Jerry, why is the Vatican interested in hearing from lapsed young Catholics as they intentionally drive traditional Latin Mass-loving young Catholics out of the pews and out of the parishes? What do they expect to hear from these lapsed or inactive Catholics?
Well, I think this is largely for consumption by the media and the public to say that what we're doing now is different than what we've done in the past. In the past, when the Synod of Bishops met, they only consulted, you know, with theologians and bishops' conferences. Now they want to say, we're talking to the man in the street. The problem is the man in the street's not interested in talking to you. He's not going to be talking to you. What really bothers me is what you just said. I know plenty of young people who'd love to be heard by the Synod, and it has to do with things like traditional liturgy, reverence at Mass. It will have to do with supporting the teaching of the Church on all aspects of not only of human sexuality, but, you know, all the aspects of the whole life of holiness. You know, we're seeing an explosion in the Church of trivialization of the Mass, of prayer, of the Christian life. That's what people are interested in. They don't want to know if young people who don't go to Mass want to blame it on the fact that their parish priest, you know, they consider him to give boring sermons. That's not the problem. The problem is, do people believe in Jesus Christ? Do they believe in heaven and hell? And do they believe that they're accountable to God for how they live? Those are the questions that, you know, need to be asked. And this is PR, and that's really, when the Vatican descends to the level of PR campaigns imitating TikTok videos, we're in trouble.
You know, Bob, when I listen to Father there, I think, you know, this is a little bit like asking people who's never heard music before out in the desert somewhere to review Aida. I mean, there's no basis of understanding, no predicate to ask their opinion of a given, you know, set of facts. So is this a case of pre-programming what they want to hear by queering the survey pool? I mean, the faith is too difficult for us to follow, so why not bring it down to our level? This is how we understand it.
Listen, we already have very good data on the opinions of young people. I mean, the real McCoy is to go to a group like the Pew Foundation, which does very, very sensitive professional surveys of all sorts of opinions, including religious opinions. In the Catholic Church, we have the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate here in Washington, which similarly is very professional and can go out and really survey and find out, you know, why are people disaffected? What do they think about the Church? Right. This stuff that we're looking at is really very hit and miss. When I first saw influencers, I said, "Oh no," because look, there's nothing wrong with there's nothing wrong with trying to get young people to engage a process. And thank God they asked Jimmy Akin to be one of the people to get involved in this, because he's a very good guy. But influencers, I had this image in my head of somebody with the camera on TikTok for 24 hours and trying to move people in one direction or another. Happily, it's not exactly that. But really, I think this is more for the Vatican's own comfort level, that they tried to reach out to people that they were not reaching. And my basic worry about this, I talked to priests and bishops who have been involved in this diocesan phase that we're still in, and I think in the next few days we're now going to move to the continental level. That's the next year is going to be the continental level.
Right.
And what they say is, look, we're trying to get the best people involved that we can, but when we pass the reports up the food chain, what gets dropped out and what gets emphasized, of course, is going to depend on who's doing the actual sifting, because you can't have everybody involved, right? I mean, that's going to be the ultimate determiner of where things come out.
Right. Who's the final edit and the final word? The German synodal path is continuing in Europe, and the German bishops this week are demanding a, quote, clear position on pressing issues. They've issued a 13-page contribution to that World Synod of Bishops. They write, equal access for all baptized people to church offices. That needs clear assessment. A reassessment of sexual morality and a non-discriminatory approach to homosexual and queer people, end quote. Father, what do you make of this call for clarity, and do you see a pattern for this at a worldwide level?
The only clarity they want is the clarity to deny Catholic teaching, and they're asking the Vatican to do that. This is a world upside down. The German hierarchy is on a collision path with Jesus Christ and his church, and they don't even have the decency to step back and say, well, the people out there who are telling us these things, we know they don't represent Catholicism, but we'll just mention the fact that they like that. No, they're proposing this as something that they endorse, they find comfortable with. Let's get down to what they're asking for. It's all the hot button issues. They want female priests. They want the acceptance of contraception and homosexual activity. They want the equalization of marriage to homosexual unions. What is this? This is pure rationalism, secularism, modern decadence. We're dealing here with something on the order of the Protestant Reformation. It's no longer Martin Luther knocking on the door of the church. It's the bishop exiting the cathedral and saying, folks, everything the church has taught you in the past, forget about it. We're going to offer you a new religion. This is disgraceful. And I would say, I've said it before on this program, these men don't have the integrity to resign their office and say, I can no longer represent a church whose teaching I don't agree with. Instead, they say, no, I'm going to subvert this teaching and use my official position, and I don't care what ordinary Catholics say. I'm in charge here. This is what we're going to do. This is disgraceful.
Yeah. Bob, Martin Luther had the decency to leave the church and create his own. These guys are trying to occupy from within in some ways. Will these reassessments of church doctrine, is this a foregone conclusion? This synodal way, Bob, seems to have a lot of momentum right now.
Well, look, there's a lot. Yeah, there is a lot of momentum. I'll tell you just a quick anecdote. I had a graduate student studying with me 20 years ago, and she was an American but stationed in Germany. She was a military person, and she came in to see me one day, and she said that she tried to set up a Marian retreat at a Marian convent, study center, some sort of Marian institution in Germany. And when she brought the proposal in, the people who actually ran this institution, this is 20 years ago, told her it was too religious. So, this has been in the German bloodstream for a long time. Another student of mine who's now living in Germany told me that the people who actually are in Mass, they're a very small percentage, mostly elderly, but they're utterly appalled at what the German bishops are trying to do. And for me, I mean, everything Father said about this, being unfaithful and it just makes no sense. It's also suicide, because no one is going to get up on a Sunday morning and come to Mass to hear the things that they can read on the front page of a secular newspaper. There's got to be something more that attracts them. We've talked a lot about the way the Latin Mass has kind of energized certain segments of the church, and it has. And maybe there are other things that can be done via liturgy or programs. But to give him to the secular world I think is the fastest route to suicide for the Church today.
In Germany, a Catholic Weekly conducted a survey which showed that a majority of German Catholics don't approve of the Vatican's stance on abortion. Get this, when asked, is it good for the Pope and the Church to speak out against abortion, only 17% agreed. A whopping 58% said they opposed the Church and the Pope speaking out on the issue. Relator General of the Synod on Synodality, Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, has also indicated openness to adjusting Church teaching on LGBT issues. LifeSite News posted a man questioning Cardinal Hollerich the other day during his tour of North America. Watch.
And I would like to ask you a very clear, final question. After this change, do you believe that sodomy should be considered a grave sin?
I do not know what the Synod will bring. We will now listen to the people of God, what they express. I start getting in reports to the Relator General of the Synod. And so reading all of that, in September we make a first draft for the continental meetings which will take place. I think that, first of all, I would never consider sexuality separated from love.
The Bible has taught, the Church has taught for 2,000 years, that sodomy is a sin, an abomination with Christ.
But the Bible also said we should stone the woman who is adulterous. The Bible has said that the sun turns around the earth. So the Bible have to give an interpretation to the
So the fundamental scriptural teaching on sin.
This is not a theological. No. It is. I know that I am in full agreement with Pope Francis.
I should mention we asked Cardinal Hollerich to come on the show this week as he's touring America. We're still awaiting a reply. Father Murray, your reaction to this biblical exegesis and the Cardinal's repeated insistence that he and Pope Francis are of one mind on these issues?
Well, he can make that assertion, but he's got to prove that to be true. What I do know is that what he's saying is ridiculous. It's absurd. The Catholic teaching on the immorality of homosexual activity is both in Revelation and the natural law. It's not subject to revision. The penalties of the Old Testament, including stoning, our Lord put those aside. Those are no longer operative. But the teaching that the misuse of the human body to commit acts of moral turpitude is somehow part of God's plan, this is ridiculous. Now, let's see what this cardinal is doing. He's a Jesuit priest, spent many years in the Far East and was named by Pope Benedict to be the Archbishop in Luxembourg. So he's come back from Japan, and he's now using this position of great authority to undermine Catholic teaching on a worldwide scale. He'll do that undoubtedly at the Synod, where he's going to be in charge of compiling all of the documents. What do we have here? We should step back. A cardinal of the Catholic Church is saying that God's revelation is bad and needs to be revised. This isn't a Catholic teaching invented by men. This comes from the good Lord. He's a man of great arrogance to say that, and he really needs to repent, because what he's doing is leading people into sin. Imagine two homosexuals in his diocese who hear him saying this. They're going to continue to commit sin, thinking that since the bishop says it's good, it must be good. Raymond, we're in a very difficult position in the church right now.
Bob, are we headed toward majority rule when it comes to following church doctrine? Faith via survey and popular opinion. That's what I hear and see when you put all these stories together.
Yeah, I think that is a profound danger. Although the Vatican and the Holy Father have said repeatedly that the church is not a democracy, that the synodal process does not just operate according to majority rule. In fact, the impression that they give, in PR terms, people often talk about what's said and what's communicated. Well, you can say that you're not interested in submitting a church teaching to a majority, but at the same time, by the way that you go about asking for people's opinions, you kind of give the impression that you are looking for a majority. You know, for me, this homosexual question, you know what I like to do when this is brought up to me is turn it back on people and say, look, we didn't invent this. This is not a bunch of Italian cardinals sitting around in Rome with nothing better to do. We're upholding the law of Moses. If you want to go against this, you can go against the Jewish tradition that goes back a couple of thousand years before even our Lord, and is a consistent teaching among the Jewish people and among Christians after them. Where you get the authority to oppose those two traditions, I don't know, other than contemporary mores, which doesn't seem to me to be faithful to anything, not to the tradition, and certainly not to God.
But Father Jerry, I'm going to say this. Having listened to Cardinal Hollerich and read a lot of his comments recently, again, he is the Relator General that the Pope has chosen to lead this worldwide synod. He is going to be the final editor-in-chief of whatever they discuss and the way it's framed. When you read him, Bob just said no one has the authority to overturn this consistent teaching from the Old Testament to the New, from the Jewish to the Christian tradition. But then he throws out, wait a minute, the Bible says to stone adulteresses. Okay? So that was a teaching that, as you said, was discarded by Jesus. He's saying there are other teachings that need to be revisited. You would say what?
It's not the same thing. You know, stoning was a legal penalty that was given by in the Old Testament. God gave it to the Jewish people. But then the Lord said he was without sin cast the first stone. The Lord put that aside. The proper use of the human body, the sexual faculty, the reproductive faculty, is inherent in God's creation. And God revealed to the people of Israel and to all mankind that the improper use of that is a perversion and a deviancy, and it's wrong. You can't change human nature, and therefore you can't change God's law governing human nature. So people who use this debating strategy would basically say every single doctrine of Catholic teaching is up for question because X happened. Jesus, turned aside. You no longer use adultery with the death penalty for adultery. Therefore, everything's subject to question. That's just a false argument.
Here in the United States, the New York Times ran a very interesting op-ed this week by First Things editor Julia Yost. It's called New York's Hottest Club is the Catholic Church. And it asserts that an area of New York City, she calls it Dime Square, has become a hip hotbed of traditional Catholicism. Father, given the Pope's harsh treatment of traditional Catholics, does this surprise you? And is this in some small way a backlash against the Church's worldly embrace, if you will?
Well, a lot of people in their 20s and 30s in New York City, and the number of them who are completely disgusted and disenchanted with the sexual revolution and the gender nonsense that's going on and the political correctness, what are your pronouns and all of this. And what do they find? Catholic life rooted in tradition, the order and beauty of nature, worship. It's very appealing. It's sort of like a back to nature movement where people say, that life on the farm has a lot to teach city dwellers. It's that kind of movement. But when you combine it with, the power of the sacraments, you can see where, people who are languishing in sinful lifestyles who turn away from it, they rejoice when they find the beauty of a traditional Catholic piety and way of life.
Yeah. When you go to some of these parishes, Father, as I did this past week in New York, it is fascinating to see all these young families, all these young people, obviously being independently drawn to this clarity and traditional practice in opposition to everything around them. I think the persecution that they're now enduring at the hands of some of their bishops and this edict that you may not practice this way or that way, it is all backlash. This is a huge backlash. What you're seeing is like the counter-revolution, the counter-Protestant revolution we saw centuries ago. It's happening before our eyes, and many are missing it. Before we run out of time, Asia News is reporting retired Hong Kong Cardinal Joseph Zen will go to trial before the Communist Chinese government starting September 19th. His Eminence and 5 pro-democracy advocates are being accused of failing to properly register a charity on which they sat and served as trustees. Bob, your thoughts? The defendants are facing a maximum fine of $1,700 or so U.S. dollars. How long might this be drawn out? Not to mention the strain on Cardinal Zen, who's in his 90s.
Yeah. Well, I was actually surprised that they had scheduled the trial as early as they did in September, because they could detain these people without trial, just with no set date. They could just keep holding them. I mean, we know that these charges are trumped up. Somehow that they're unregistered foreign agents. That they're threatening the party. This is the exact same thing that we were talking about earlier in Nicaragua. These communist regimes all have the same DNA. They're repressive. It's the party that is the repository of all truth, of all freedom, of all democracy. And anybody who opposes this single political force in a country is somehow evil. It reproduces itself. It did in the Soviet Union. It did in Latin America. It did in Africa. And now, unfortunately, it's still continuing in China. But God bless the Cardinal, God bless Jimmy Lyon, the others who were brave enough to stand up to the Chinese and actually stayed there. They could have left and been free these days. They stayed there, and now their trials are going to show the world something about the nature of China's regime.
No, it's revealing, as was the Pelosi visit last week to Taiwan. That was revealing, too, because you saw how angry and explosive their rage was that someone dared to defy even a visit, a diplomatic visit, was a cause of controversy and hatred from the Chinese government. They want to control everything, and the world needs to stand up, particularly the Quad in the Asian Pacific, and tell them, no, you don't get to call the tune. Father, all the accused, including Cardinal Zen, have pleaded not guilty. Do they have any hope of a fair trial, given this Chinese national security law?
I doubt they'll get a fair trial, but at least they're getting a public trial, and I hope we can hear their statements and testimony. But the bigger story is, as Bob identifies, it's self-condemnatory of the Chinese Communist Party, because when you treat a retired cardinal and a few associates who raised money to help people who have been imprisoned earlier because of their protesting activities, it shows how fragile the regime considers its own ideology. And that really is, people who tell lies are conscious of the fact that they're lying, and the only ones who can really overturn them are people who believe in the truth. So Cardinal Zen, he's very calm, and I admire him for it. But it's up for us in the West to stand up and say, look, Communist China wants to do business with the West. Communist China has to be honest and deal with its citizens fairly. It's no good if we can get cheap products in the U.S., and the Chinese people, like the Cardinal, are in prison simply because they say the truth.
Well, a generation ago, we had the Vatican and the United States government and all of Europe united in their outrage over these kind of human rights and religious abuses. And they took material steps to block and stop that. We do not have that in the case of China. The whole world is rolling over. Pope Francis has, the Vatican has, Joe Biden and the Biden administration have, and for whatever her failings, God bless Nancy Pelosi for going and standing up to this regime and taking a stand in Taiwan. It is one of the bright lights in a career without a lot of them. Gentlemen, we will leave it there. For commentary by Robert Royal and Father Gerald Murray, visit thecatholicthing.org. And Calming the Storm, Navigating the Crises Facing, or the Crisis Facing the Catholic Church and Society by Father Gerald Murray is available in bookstores everywhere. Father Jerry, enjoy your vacation now.
Thank you.